summer semester's The Healing Arts Encounters in Art and Medicine. My name is Lukas Feireis. I'm a curator, I'm an educator, and a board member of the International Society for Arts and Medicine. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. And this evening is special for two reasons. First, it marks the closing of this semester's Healing Arts series. Some of you might not know what the Healing Arts series is. The Healing Arts series is a conversation platform at the intersection of art, medicine, and science that we've been running since 2 years, that brings together guests from different fields of expertise and knowledge, from healthcare and from healing, or from health, from care, and from healing. And secondly, today serves as a public opening of the International Congress, the Healing Arts Forging Alliances of Arts and Medicine, which officially begins tomorrow and will bring together, and already brought together, artists, clinicians, researchers, therapists, educators, and policymakers from around the world here in Berlin over the next couple of days. Out of curiosity, to read the room, how many of you are from the field of medicine? Please raise your hand. And how many of you are from the field of psychology, psychiatry? And how many of you are from the field of humanities, all the way to anthropology maybe? How about art therapy? And how about the arts? Okay, I feel like a lot of people lifted the hand more than once. And this is actually, that's the point of this whole Congress. That's actually the point of the Healing Arts series, but it's beautiful to see. So, looking back at this semester has taken us on a very fascinating journey across very different ways of knowing. We began with Dr. Shotima Böttcher and Maciej Czerma exploring the relationships between neuroinflammation, the microbiome, and embodied cognition, food culture, and sensory experience. We asked how health emerges not only through biology, but through complex interactions between body, environment, perception, and everyday practice. With Monika Ankele and Angela Alves, the conversation shifted towards questions of illness, of vulnerability, patient perspectives, and the politics of care. We explored how bodies are represented, remembered, cared for, and often overlooked within medical and social systems. And last week, together with Ivan Nenchev and Felix from Kennedy and Swan, we entered the rapidly evolving terrain of artificial intelligence, language, and mental health, asking what happens when machines increasingly participate in domains once considered uniquely human. And across all these conversations, one theme kept returning. How do we understand health, care, and healing in a world that is becoming ever more complex? And perhaps equally important, whose knowledge counts when we try to answer these questions? And these conversations do not end when the evening ends. They continue in reflections, in discussions, and sometimes in unexpected places afterwards. Tonight's conversation brings us to a topic that sits at the heart of many of the social, political, and personal transformations shaping our present moment. Migration, displacement, trauma, memory, grief, belonging, and the possibility of healing. Our two guests approach these questions from very different, yet remarkably complementary perspectives. Nora Amin is a renowned multidisciplinary artist, choreographer, writer, performer, scholar, and grief practitioner. Her work engages with feminism, political resistance, decoloniality, migration, memory, trauma, and healing. And across performance, writing, ritual, and embodied practice, she explores how personal and collective wounds can be transformed into spaces of agency, remembrance, and renewal. Joining her is Professor Dr. Ulrike Kluge, Professor of Psychological and Medical Integration in Migration Research at Charité and Head of the Department of Migration, Mental and Physical Health and Health Promotion at the Berlin Institute for Empirical Integration and Migration Research. As a psychologist, psychoanalyst, and researcher, her work focuses on migration, trauma, transcultural psychiatry, global mental health, and equitable access to care. What makes this pairing particularly compelling to me is not only their shared interest in these topics, but the fact that both work across boundaries that are too often treated as separate. Nora Amin is not only an artist, performer, and writer, but also a scholar with a PhD in cultural policy. Ulrike Kluge is not only a psychologist and researcher, but also a clinician working directly with people whose lives are shaped by migration, displacement, and social inequality. Both work in deeply intersectional ways. Both move between academia and society, between research and practice, between individual experience and structural conditions. Both ask how trauma is carried, not only by individuals, but across bodies, communities, institutions, and histories. And both are interested in forms of feeling that are not limited to treatment alone, but involve questions of recognition, of participation, of dignity, and agency. In many ways, they represent some of the central tensions that have accompanied us this entire semester. Science and the arts, analysis and experience, evidence and lived reality, vulnerability and strength, resistance and empowerment. And together they invite us into a conversation that moves between lived experience and clinical practice, between individual stories and societal structures, between grief and resilience, and ultimately between the question of what wounds us and what helps us heal. So thank you all for being here tonight. And as always, we begin with 2 short inputs from our guests. So you have to imagine it's always 15-minute inputs from the guests, and then we have a Q&A session. I will ask the first few questions, but then it's really up to you to join the conversation. That said, Nora, Ulrike, welcome. Let's begin, and we start with you, Ulrike. A warm applause for Ulrike Kluge.
Good evening. I'm really thankful and really grateful to be here tonight. And I actually assumed that I'm sitting in a room with an audience of like 10 people. So I'm rather a bit overwhelmed. Lucas mainly said all the words that I will give a short introduction connecting this to my work. And I brought maybe too many slides because 15 minutes to talk about all this that was in the announcement already mentioned is not a lot, but I get started and we just stop. So maybe just as a beginning, since crossing boundaries, this is a kiosk we invented from one of our research projects. It's the kiosk of solidarity, and we moved with that through the city to do research on housing, labor, and health, and work together with practitioners who use the kiosk to really getting connected to communities. So this is just as an introduction that we have been working quite a long time with artists. So this is a quote that I carried with me since October 2023, and a colleague of mine have been working with people in Israel from the Arabic and from the Jewish community. He said this to me during a phone call and said, mourning is a relational thing. It needs a lot of effort. So what I'm going to say about my work, I'm bringing some aspects about the institutional embeddedness, and then I talk about our clinical practice at the Center for Cross-Cultural Psychiatry, Psychotherapy, and then I bring an idea that we work in our clinical work, but also in our research, like trauma as a black box. And then I get from there into questions on how do we connect and how do we look at vulnerability, vulnerabilization, and resilience. And then I move this into our recent work on transnational living realities and how they are impacting mental health. So this is just to get you an idea where I'm located. I'm doing this very fast. So there's a German Center for Migration and Integration Research where we are located with our Berlin Institute of Migration and Integration Research. This is Charité and Humboldt-Universität in Berlin. And then at Charité, it's not only research, it's also clinical practice, and we have this tiny space in the outpatient ambulance that's called Center for Cross-Cultural Psychiatry and Psychotherapy. And then through that, I'm coming to that in a bit, our main aim usually is to bring research also into new services, into new psychosocial networks. So this is just like 3 recent research projects, just to have like an agenda setting where our research is taking place. So one, it's called Transmit. It's working on transnational perspectives on migration and integration, and we're doing research along migration and flight routes in Senegal, Gambia, and in Lebanon, Turkey, and Germany. And then in Berlin, located in a cooperation with Oxford, there's the Einstein Center for Population Diversity, where we work right now on transnational families and how transnationalism is impacting mental health. And then, since Lucas talked about situating knowledge or producing knowledge, we're having a project together with colleagues from theology, taking place in Berlin and in different universities in South Africa. And we're looking into how transforming of religion is impacting social transformation and the other way around. So this is very interdisciplinary as well. So our main aim with all of our research is really having a global perspective on mental health. If you're doing migration research, usually you look either way in the countries of origin, or you're doing looking at the countries where people are replaced to. And what we're interested in looking on structural inclusion and exclusion, and then migration as a central perspective. This sounds like very banal, but it's not so banal. Really understanding migration not as an exception or as something that can be over one day, but really looking at migration as an analytical category and saying our society is migration driven. So I mentioned this already, that our research, due to this idea of that migration as a central category and migration as like structuring lives, we're doing all our research along the routes where people are coming from, or where people are migrating back and forth or flying back and forth, or to different spaces. So, and I said this already, and this is really something what is very important for my research group, that we're trying to bring our research into the Berlin lab, put it in that way, but really bringing research into practice. So the ZIPP, this clinical center, is like one part of that, and then we developed a project that's called Transfer as a psychosocial research network, where we do a lot of training on migration, on intersectionality, on racism. And then one of our main aim right now is to fight also politically to bring medical interpretation into clinical practice. So this is the Simple project, and I just loved this name when we decided to do it, to put it there, because it's so simple and it's just so difficult to implement this in Germany. So this is the center, just to have like a very brief idea what is the Center for Cross-Cultural Psychiatry about. So our main idea, Luca said, we're working transculturally. So this is like one thing, but mainly we're really interested in addressing migration, culture, and language sensitive issues and really bringing them together. And so in our outpatient service, we have single and group therapy, and we usually work with interpreters because there's like 190 different languages in Berlin. So even though you would have a team that is multilingual, you wouldn't be able to like address and meet the language needs of all the patients. So we do work together with a lot of lawyers, with social services throughout the city, and so there's always the tension, how do we also act in political circumstances, and what is our responsibility we take in? Do we write reports for court, and how many do this, and how many time do we use for that instead of doing our clinical work? So who is interested more what we're doing in the center, there's this tiny QR code. I'm really proud that I was able to create this. There you find all the information, what we do in detail, what is our multidisciplinary team looking like, what are the countries of origin our team is coming from. And relating this to what I said before, migration as a central category, the ZIPP is located just behind the main train station, so it's Berlin Mitte, and in Berlin Mitte, counted by a German term as people with a migration background, so it's first and second generation. We have 59% of people with the so-called migration background, so it's rather the majority than the minority. So then the question is, why do we need specialized services? So our main aim is really to distributing this kind of knowledge and expertise to say this is something that should take place in regular care and not just in specialized services. And so I mentioned this already, just to be aware of that. There's 190 different languages that are spoken in Berlin. And putting this together, really, there was a shift in our service from really looking at cultural differences and saying this is not the issue. Cultural differences, you can't really grasp them because there's so much hybridity, and people are coming from one country, living for 20 years in the next country, moving and getting married to someone from a different country, and then there's different cultures because nations are not like equal with different cultures. So this is actually not the main topic. The main topic is really addressing different migration and transnational realities. And the other thing is, and probably a lot of you in the room know this, that the reality of a lot of us is not that we are living in one geographical space. We usually do have people living across, like close family members, friends, and like our living realities are much more transnational today than ever before, with all this burden. So then when it comes to mental health, for example, being in Berlin, being from Ukraine, being from Palestine, being from Iran, and having your whole family in those countries of origin, and being every day on the mobile phone, being connected with all those war, crimes, violence, and how this is actually impacting your mental health as well. This hasn't been addressed in the last years and not in research that much. So this is what we're actually looking at right now, because it's so prominent and so obvious, and you just can't overlook it anymore. So just how this is then going back, like our practice with interpreters, for example, is getting back into this implementation project on language mediation in healthcare, and then realizing that racism is also in our clinical practice a huge issue. We get a lot of emails saying, could you refer us to a racism-sensitive psychotherapist, or do you know of POC or BIPOC therapists? Do you have BIPOC therapists in your team? So we're a very small team. So altogether we are 4 people. So we can't serve all those needs. And this is why we started this tiny project where we did an online survey across Germany and looked at who feels actually capable of dealing with racism in psychotherapy, and by doing the research at the same time developing a network. So there's like an online network right now taking place every month, where people are invited who are interested in the topic, where we do teachings, but at the same time connecting people, providing supervision. So there's this 5-minute sign. So the one point I wanted to make, and I'm not getting, I can share the slides with the organizer and you can all have it. Maybe just 2 sentences on this group psychotherapy we have been doing for Arabic-speaking women. We've been doing one for men as well. And I just wanted to illustrate with this example why we are not doing like focused trauma therapy. And just because we knew from like people that came from war regions, for example, from former Yugoslavia, that the circumstances in the arriving countries like Germany are so difficult to find the space where you actually can start feeling safe and developing something and opening up, that it doesn't make sense if someone arrives to start with the trauma therapy. So we developed this group setting in like the main topics of the group were bearing witness, finding one's own voice again, trying out forms of resistance, and that was really like the main work in the group. And also, when I say finding one's own voice again, that was also because I just brought you some newspaper, it's all in German, but there was the German newspapers in 2015, 2016, and every day you had stories, reports on traumatized refugees. So if you had been a refugee by then, you were like the traumatized refugee. It was just like a one word, and either way, you were a victim or were perceived as a victim, or you were perceived as the potential perpetrator in the future. So there was a lot of like radicalization is one of the main issues. So we thought this is maybe one of our tasks as well, to like giving people their whole life story back in therapy, making them also something more than just a traumatized refugee. So the black box trauma, and this took us then to all the trauma discourses again, and there's like really a great work on that. One colleague, psychoanalytic colleague from Norway, he brought this quote, and I think it's, I'm going to bring this in the last 3 minutes. The concept of trauma, because there was the question for us, so what is actually the need that like this trauma refugee topic is just so prominent, and why, what is actually packed into this concept of trauma? And so Warren says the concept of trauma relieves clinicians and the public of intolerable feelings triggered by extreme experiences. The term trauma becomes a place where alien and unbearable elements can be deposited in such a way that at least some meaning can be attributed to the uncanny experience evoked in countertransference. So whoever of you worked with traumatized people, or people who had experienced a lot of violence and war and crime, that if they're coming in the room and telling you those stories, you can feel all this pain, you can feel all the sadness, all the grief, and then saying this is trauma is something that actually hinders you really getting into a relationship. So, how many minutes? 3. And my classes. I actually said I need my classes, and now the slides become smaller, and my age becomes growing. So when I talked about the group, this is actually something what like we realized that we really have. When I talked about the group, like the Arabic-speaking group and the trauma, one thing that became so obvious, and also in our research, that the continuities of suffering and pain, that we have to address them. And so for refugees in Germany, this mainly means, even though people looked a lot of how war and crime and violence affecting people in the countries of origin or on their route, but what is actually happening in Germany is there's a lot of uncertainties due to like residence issues. There's a lot of racism. There's a lot of legal dependencies. There's no possibility to work. You are housed in very precarious shelters. So addressing this and making this something that has to be addressed in therapy, and it's not something that happens somewhere else. You have to take this in your psychotherapeutic treatment. And then another issue that became very prominent for us, in medicine, people talk about vulnerable groups. So refugees are seen as vulnerable groups. If you look into the social science, then there's a totally different discussion on vulnerability and vulnerabilization. So in this project, what I just mentioned, like Cures of Solidarity, we really tried to make sense of like a sociological approach of how vulnerability and resistance are actually connected to each other, and how can we bring this in our psychotherapeutic and medical understanding and saying, oh, are those groups really vulnerable? Or do we actually have to look at how people are vulnerabilized and how this is taking place through power relations, through structural violences? So this carried us the last years into looking more into structural vulnerabilities and looking more into social suffering. So saying we need this kind of social, sociological, medical, anthropological perspectives also in our clinical practice, to not looking only at the individual, but looking what like social circumstances are creating in mental health. And then the question is, and a lot of activists who are suffering from war a lot and coming to us and saying, oh, actually, I don't need a psychotherapy. I need someone who changes the world. And then the question is, so what are we actually doing with that? But being aware that this is not an individual problem, that this is something that is really impacted by a lot of crime and structural violence. This is something very relevant for like relationship building already. So the minute is over. As I said, I would send this to the organizer, and then they can distribute this, and we can continue in our conversation.
Hello. It's a bit too far for me. I try to bring it closer. I don't know how, because I don't want to lean like this. Yes? So, oh my God, it's very scary. And I feel like a total alien. I have written a presentation 3 times, just to be very well prepared, and now the last version of the presentation has gone lost on my laptop. So here I am, without any weapons to defend myself. So I am here as an artist who creates performances. So I am creating performances since 33 years. I am originally Egyptian. I lived all my life in Egypt and came to Berlin 10 years ago with a lot of nomadic life in between. And the performances I create are dance performances. Sometimes I call them rituals. Sometimes I call them participatory performances. Sometimes I call them interactive documentary dance performances. The 2 facets that shape all my work through the 33 years are trauma and activism. And of course, growing up in Cairo and Egypt, we become exposed to gender-based violence, to the effects of patriarchy, to a very, very high percentage of women and girls who are survivors of sexual violence, sexual violation, and rape. Forward like this. So this means that there is quite a big number of the population, let's say 90% of half of the population are survivors of violence and trauma. If you want to look at the statistics about female genital mutilation, you can find that maybe it has lowered a lot and became maybe 84%, after having been for long years 96 and 97%. If you want to look at the percentages of public sexual violence and sexual harassment, we will find that maybe at least 95% of women and girls are facing this on a daily basis. So this is to give a background to why trauma and activism have central place in my work. Because first, I'm a woman. I'm a survivor of this trauma and many other kinds of trauma, including impairment and chronic disorders and everything. So maybe I cannot stand more than 10 minutes, which is good for time. And I understood that the stage, which is a place that needs to be decolonized in my own point of view, and needs also to be liberated from the patriarchal craft, and needs to be more sensitive to the everyday realities of the audiences, that the stage can be also a space for healing and a space for activism. And here I try to use the term of stage activism. I will speak first about stage activism and then why stage activism is connected for me to healing. So, activism is taking action towards injustices. And if the stage is a public place, then it is a space that can announce and declare those injustices and make it public. It's a place for public criticism to systems of governance, to patriarchy, to social values. It is also a place for those who are muted or marginalized to speak out or to find stories that relate to them. It is a space to remove the shaming and make the stories of victims become stories of survivors and heroines and heroes. That means that the stage becomes a platform for a kind of public action taking. And I understand that this can go through documentary performances, which is part of my work, where I try to bring testimonies about the injustices that produced the traumatic experiences. And I try to make the relation between the patriarchal system and the systems of governance. And if we need to change or to repair or to transform the trauma, it is not enough to heal the individual. We need to change the system. Otherwise, I think total repair is impossible. And otherwise, we also remain connected to other bodies that are still being inflicted and still being traumatized, and therefore our whole ecological system of trauma and injustice doesn't change. I understood that stage activism is also one way to make me convinced that as a survivor, I am not weak. I'm very powerful, even with all the traumas I have, and that we all have power, and that the idea that we may be weak or not able is an idea that is imposed by a pedagogy of oppression, and it's aimed to disempower the power that exists. So my job is to retrieve and reclaim that inherent power. I also understood that I can face stories and choreographies of violence and of victimhood from a transformative point of view. This is even getting better than the paper I wrote. So, because in the paper I tried to defend myself, and now I just let go. And the transformative choreography is a choreography that is based on research, researching the embodiment of pain and emotional wounds, the embodiment of violence. And it starts with a personal research for myself, so I become a topic for that research. And during that research, I try to understand how the body reacts and responds. And of course, I read a lot of books, but I also use an instinctive and natural talent. So I experience and I observe myself experiencing, and I try to understand, and then I may have access to change. But first of all, I need to experience. So I need to experience the pain, the trauma. I cannot deny it. How can I change it if I deny it? Because we cannot heal something that doesn't exist. So to experience and to observe, leading to an awareness, and this awareness might move us away from fear and panic, because we start to understand that the body has its own wisdom and we can trust our body. And then I can understand also that there is a system of protection and there is balance and there is a lot of dynamics in the body. So I can observe myself when my husband passes away suddenly from cancer, alone, in a different country. We are both migrants. We speak about migration. And I can see my heart rate accelerating like crazy, as if it's going to jump out of my chest. My breathing is changing, and my whole embodiment, and there is shakes somewhere in my bodies, and I need more air. And gradually, and while observing and experiencing throughout several months, I start to realize that somehow I am reproducing some choreographies from the rituals of mourning and grief, from ancient Egypt, from contemporary Egypt. We have a long thread of heritage where we keep passing on our rituals. And I start to understand this choreography, that it is coming out of examining the human behavior. Maybe this is something in common between us, examining human behavior. And that the human behavior has an embodiment and has a somatic expression. And that also somatic expressions can be studies in order to maybe create new patterns of behavior. Then dance and re-choreographing situations of violence in a documentary performance can take me from the initial position of victimhood into transforming and reclaiming the power of myself, into becoming a survivor, into creating the dance of confrontation and resistance towards victory and self-dignity on stage. And it works. It even works for me as a survivor. How do I know if this works as a way of repair? It shows a possibility. It shows an imaginative possibility to take action from the self, so that the survivor or the patient is also a collaborator in the healing process. And then the activist part comes in 5 minutes, where the space opens to become an interactive sharing and inviting the audience to share their own testimonies. And this moment is crucial because it is where people start to feel that they also own the stage. It is not only for those who have made research and trained and choreographed, it's for anybody in the room. There is no divide anymore, because divide is a tool of oppression, like Paulo Freire says. And they can take the stage and they can speak about their testimonies. And in this moment, the community of spectators or of survivors become also a community of solidarity. We feel acknowledged, and we feel that we have created a little group therapy together, maybe, I don't know. This is another thing very much in common. But it also shows in this almost imaginary space, because it's not totally imaginary, that there are possibilities of healing that coincide with the original meaning of healing where I come from, and maybe this makes us different, because healing for me in Arabic is al-mudawa. Al-mudawa is the healing. The first three letters mean alam. Alam means pain. Mudawa means healing. Dawa means medication or healing, but dawa in itself, in its linguistic origin, is comprised of two meanings, and it is the wound and it is the healing in one word. And it makes me understand that even if we are wounded, we still have the ability to heal within the peak of our wound. And it goes back to Auguste Boal when he says with his Chinese crisis that a crisis is a place where you face the conflict or the pain, and is also still a moment where you can find a way out. Hope. So crisis and hope in one word. Thank you for listening.
I'm so happy that you lost the script, Nora. I am so happy. We quickly move these chairs up so that you can actually see us. And then I would like to ask you, Ulrike and Nora, up on stage on these two chairs. I'll break the ice with a few questions, and then it's really for you to come and join us. There's a mic in the middle, so whenever you have a question, you just walk into the middle aisle and ask a question, and no shame in the game. Don't be afraid to ask a question. No? That's why we're here for. I have to turn this around. No, I don't turn this around. Oh, yeah, maybe I also get a mic. Also while the mics are being turned on, again, I have to repeat this, Nora, I'm really glad that you that you lost the script. This was really impressive, and also thank you to you, Ulrike. I'm very inspired, and a great example of how powerful and how much strength is in vulnerability. And thank you also for sharing so personally, Nora. That means a lot. On that note, I usually start, the mics are on? Okay, good. I usually start with a personal question, but in a way, Nora, you already answered that, and so it's up to you now, Ulrike. I wonder, because you're also persons with a biography, we heard about Nora's kind of autobiographical context. I wonder what brought you into this topic, you as a person, and not the professional.
The migration research to the...
the mic closer to your mouth, if the sound, no?
Yeah. The micro?
Yeah, closer,
like
this.
I mean, the migration research brought me, and it's a bit a tricky story. I grew up in the East, and after I've been doing all this transcultural migration research after a couple of years, I thought, so what did actually bring me here? And then I realized, growing up in the East, a country that doesn't exist anymore, there's this word by colleagues saying it has been a migration without leaving the space or leaving the place. So I remember my adolescence that my parents were as absent, taking care of other changes and taking care of transformation. Like I see this with a lot of my immigrant patients and their children being what is the English word? Parentifiziert, in the sense of being very mature and taking care of a lot of responsibilities that are not appropriate for their age. So this brought me there, and then I think just I don't know, in the pre-talk we had this. I think it's just a very instinct feeling of justice. I think this brings a lot of my interest in the research we are doing right now, where I feel that even so in the medical field, even though it's a lot of thinking about human rights to care, but then there's so much injustice, and not just in the healthcare system, in the world, that is impacting so much health issues, and it's very straightforward and also maybe a bit naive. But the last years I have been sitting even more at home or with friends or with colleagues and saying, I mean, how can we produce this more and more wounds and more grief and sadness and violence, and then people are coming in our treatment center, and I know the number is increasing because we're studying the next war and the next war and the next war and the next war, and we know what the mental health outcomes are. This is not such a hopeful perspective, but we get to the hope.
And maybe I would jump maybe also to hope, but embodiment, that was a topic that was very prominent in your talk also, Nora, and I think maybe generally speaking we often associate trauma more as a psychological phenomena, but actually in both of your talks we understood this is more than that, it's cultural, it's physical. So maybe we start with you, Nora. What, like trauma that is also carried by bodies, by relationships, maybe by structures. How do you, like, what can the body tell that maybe language cannot? What does the body know that language cannot know?
I think I want to approach this question from maybe the topic of grief, specifically grief as part of the more general trauma threads, and with the topic of grief, because I also in my own research and I started to study grief coaching, and I wanted to become a grief coach so that I can also learn something to bring back to my stage work. And this is, I try to mix between them now. I understood that there is a kind of universal language in the body for grief, and that it is not only related to grief caused by death. So there is also grief caused by losing the homeland, or losing the initial mother tongue, or losing family, or losing body parts, impairment, disability, or losing a life dream, or all this we know. And I feel that this is existing everywhere, especially that I feel that the earth itself is in a process of grief and mourning. I think it's we cannot ignore it. We cannot ignore what is happening to the body of nature, to the body of the earth, and it's also happening in our bodies. And I think maybe sometimes an attitude of feeling stiff or shaky can become part of the vocabulary of dance on stage, to see what it can produce. And I think the opposite of being totally distant and totally strict and alien to others in public transportation, I read it also as a way to preserve and block the trauma of grief within the body. And the pedagogy and the culture has an influence if we release it or not, and how we release it, but it is in the body. And I think with a pedagogy that shames emotionality and sharing and looks at wounds as something we need to swallow and eat and keep inside, this grief is going to be locked in for a long time.
Thank you. And Ulrike, how do you in your daily practice encounter experiences that exceed therapeutic frameworks?
I mean, as you said in the beginning, I'm a psychoanalyst, and there's a lack of the body in psychoanalytic theory. And this is really a problem, especially with the patients I work with, and with all that, what I said before. So what I didn't talk about is the concepts we work with, like containing and holding. So really understanding the space also where we work at. For example, if I see patients, the nurses that are at the entrance, they're very important as people, as bodies for us, because they look at me and say, did you see Mrs. Oh, here, we got some cookies, might they help? And so this it's not just bodies, but it's relations through people. And then what we have been figured out for us, and we're doing this when we do presentations on cases by now, even in public. And for example, you talk about mourning and about grief, but for a lot of people who just survived, grieving and mourning is really something that needs to be learned. And with a lot of my patients, it's really the main part of our beginning work is to finding expressions, and not just words, but finding expressions to mourn and to cry. And I experienced myself in really taking this part of the psychoanalytical understanding serious, like finding patterns of relations and really getting into a relation and not just putting someone, but saying, my job is to start a relation that might be a healing relation. And then part of this is that I'm able to cry, to take this kind of sadness into me and like witnessing it through my body and giving it back. And it just happens quite often. And my professional colleagues might say, oh, this is not very professional. But I can actually frame it and can say, so this is obviously what you can't express right now, but I can feel it and I can give it back. And this is really like a starting point for a relationship and for trust building. And I'm not doing it as you said, like a learned performance. I'm just doing it as a psychotherapist that is a human being at the same time.
Actually, you brought the word healing in, and this is the Healing Arts Congress, this is the Healing Arts Series. It's a big term, so maybe we had this discussion also when we had our pre-talk. You gave us a very beautiful and deep and poetic definition, an etymological one, but also for you, Ulrike, I mean, obviously it's let's say, from my understanding, beyond treating symptoms, the way you define healing, but how do you approach that? How do you define healing for yourself?
Should I start?
Yeah, maybe you start. I mean, we had this beautiful etymological explanation. I would like you to expand on this one, but back to you, Ulrike.
Yeah,
and by the way, sorry, this is a great question for all of us to think about, no? All of us in the room. What do we understand under this term?
All my professional life, I'm very much struggling with the term of healing, and coming from medical anthropology as well. There is like so many different understandings of healing, and you brought the repair in. And in our pre-talk, I talked about a colleague from the arts, Kada Atya. He does a lot on the concept of repair, and he like. He challenges us with this Japanese art of like, I don't know what this is called, probably you guys. And making available the wound and making available the scarves and making visible the scarves. And I think this is something what in some understandings of healing, and this is where I'm struggling with, there is an idea of we can repair something fully and then the scarves and the wounds are not visible anymore. And maybe this is something where I would say this is just not, this wouldn't even be my intention. Because I don't believe in that, and I would say this is like erasing memories and erasing also collective memories that are just there. And if they are visible and if we make them visible, even digestible, and maybe this is part of our psychotherapeutic work, and digest is maybe not the best word, but I think it's very, as an image, like digesting it, but it's not gone. It has been part of a process.
I want to add something
Perfect.
from here. So for me, the wound doesn't disappear. And I don't need it to disappear. It's part of my history, it's part of my archival memory, it's part of my ancestral thread. But in my understanding, the repair or the regeneration, or a better word from my side, the transformation, is a transformation that happens by acknowledging the wound and acknowledging the reasons, the settings, the bigger system that leads to that wound, and also understanding how the body experiences and lives with it. And then there is a long process, and it could be a lifelong process, where our identities go through transformations to rebalance and compensate what the wound interrupted in our growth and in our identity unity. So actually, the wound doesn't have to disappear, but it's a whole process of understanding this part that was affected, that part that was taken out of our identity, how to transform the identity and make it grow and continue after this interruption. So I think all kinds of trauma and grief is a kind of reconstruction of identity and transformation, and it's a lifelong process. I think it also goes with endurance and believing in the power of the self to survive, believing in life as a force, and also there is something in it that has to do with how we all connect in the social fabric and in the human fabric. And for this, I think healing is also a collective process. It's not individual.
Ulrike, you wanted to add also something?
Yeah, maybe something that didn't fit in my presentation in 15 minutes is that we're right now like collecting, and we call them like transnational narratives of health. And what we're doing is we're inviting people in video workshops, people from the community we have been working with before, who like talking to their relatives, families, and collecting their narratives of social suffering, of social violence, and really making this a joint process. And when you were talking about the stage, I felt this is actually what we are somehow doing as well, because people say, oh, the work of doing this kind of videos is relevant because we are witnessing something, we are sharing something, but it's also relevant that we're coming together as a group in those workshops and really feeling and witnessing. I mean, this, and then when you were talking, I also felt, if I just see some of my patients now from my inner eye, some of them are not at the stage yet that they're able for a transformation where they're capable of holding that. So what is a lot of our work is really to talk to people, and psychologists would say psychoeducation, but I wouldn't call it different. I would rather say it's a healing performance, maybe also to tell people, so you are not mad, you're not mentally ill. There was like circumstances that were unbearable. And this is so powerful if you say this, because usually people come into the mental health care system and they're seen as someone with symptoms. And all those circumstances are not brought into the room, and bringing them into the room and saying, so this is a totally appropriate reaction, and I see how much your body and your soul is reacting in a way that you have so much fear of your own experience. I mean, you described it so nicely how you worked through that, but this is where we usually start in a very basic moment where people are just full of this pain and just can't find words and can't situate themselves anywhere. And then really, and this is the psychoanalytical point of view, believing that bringing words to that and being there as a body and as someone, I mean, I'm usually not touching my patients, but I'm pretending in a way to like calm someone down if someone is really paranoid and feels like the prison is like our treating room, and saying, so you're not in the prison right here, so look at me. And this is a bit like a performance as well, but it's also very, and this brings me back to the world and how the world is shaped, that so many people are experiencing things every day and violence every day, that they're becoming or they're getting into a state like this, and this gets me really not only sad but also very angry. And then the resistance idea is so much also a hope, because it's not so easy to get there, to understand there is resistance in this as well, because you have to have the mental means.
There's already the first questions from the audience. Tuli, I saw you. Maybe you quickly introduce yourself and then ask.
Hi, I'm Tuli. I'm an art therapist and also have an art installation in the chapel. And thank you so much for opening the conversation on this. And I wanted to ask, since I also grew up in East Germany, and with the rise of the far right, we all know what's happening to the arts field. For example, in the city where I'm from, in Halle right now, they're trying to ban non-German plays from theaters. And I wanted to know what the current political situation is doing to your research, and then maybe also to you, the relationship between you and your research. Yeah.
Thank you. Straight away.
Yeah, I mean, there's no official saying, but I mean, in Germany, in research in general, there's like a lack of funding the last years and decreasing funding, and this is also because of like destroying of infrastructure. So there's a lot of funding replacing usually infrastructural funding. But still, my colleagues would say no migration project has been funded the last year. But I'm not want to get into that, because I would say we're finding ways around to frame it differently, or to, I don't know, to continue our research. But I don't want to downplay it. I mean, it is an issue, and it's becoming worse if the elections happen as we fear them. But at the same time, and I'm really trying also to every time bring the hope and the resistance part also into the room, because at the same time there's a lot of colleagues, and also young colleagues. They're really like this project Transforming Solidarities. There's no funding anymore, but the network still exists, and people are meeting, and there's like great projects, for example, in Moabit, Galerie Nord, just right around the corner. They're doing really interesting labor migration research and community capacity building. So there's a lot of things happening, and even so, as I said, I don't want to downplay it, but there is also resistance in those transformations in that right-wing direction.
There was another question from the audience. Maybe you can step to the mic as well. And again, quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Justice. I'm an artist, and I've worked in clinical trials as well, but Boal's work, this inviting people to participate, I was curious about the role of trust in both of your work to create, either with a lot of for communication or just a very intentional setting the day of, an environment where people can own the space, and the theater is something I'm just really curious about from your perspectives.
Maybe you start, Nora? Yeah.
There is a lot to say about the work of Boal as participatory, popular performance, forum theater. I am inspired by that, and I worked with that for a lot of years, and I created maybe the biggest project for theater for change in the Arab region. But when I speak now about healing, I'm just inspired by the idea of participation and understanding the obstacles to participation as belonging to the ideology of oppression. So I try to make a political interpretation of the blockages of participation in that sense. With forum theater, also it's necessary to know that we don't parachute to communities, but the performance or the topic is taken from the community's issues, and there is a lot of representation from the community into the creation of the forum play. And this trust comes because the community is a partner in creating the performance. And in relation to the other participatory processes, for instance, my grief performance, which is gonna run on Saturday and Sunday, Publicity, Acker Stadtpalast, I want to say that there is a kind of disclaimer. So we need to announce what this is about, what you're going to experience. and also explain how we invite the people to participate. So they are not shocked, they are not forced to participate, and those who attend will know that this is what they want to participate in, and it's made by choice. I'm done.
Yeah, maybe just to add tiny aspects to that. For example, doing this kind of research is, and we just published in a very great book, we're in the advertisement section now, a great book, Solidaritäten transformieren. It's only published in German, but it's free available on the Adox Verlag. And we published a chapter on how to do this kind of transdisciplinary research, as we call it, and all those obstacles. And one main obstacle is like funding and acknowledgement through acknowledgement. So research is usually taking place for like 2 or 3 years if we talk about trust building, and if you start newly in a community on a new project, then you need we need with our groups like 1.5, 2 years before we actually can get started, but then the project's already over. So we have the advantage that we're doing this for quite a long time already, and we know communities, but at the same time, and this is maybe a very straightforward answer to your question, I'm really happy every time that I got colleagues who are sociologists and quantitative researchers, some of them as well, from very different areas in the world. And every one of them, when we developed this kind of research projects, for example, this video workshop and like those groups we had before where we exchanged with co-researchers, what could those video workshops be like, that people bring very different angles into that and say we can't do that. And if we do that, if we do really videos like filming of something that is politically probably threatening for someone, talking about that in public, then we should have the option for people to drop out, or we should talk with the filmmaker. So very detailed work on how we tailor our approaches that everyone feels safe, or maybe even getting one step back, because this word of safety is just an illusion, but what do people need to maybe say, oh, I can participate here?
There was one last question from the audience before I come to my closing question.
Yes. Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Shanice. I'm a policy analyst and a doctoral student. So my question is for Ulrike. I have a comment first, then a question. I really appreciated how you mentioned how social structures impact vulnerabilities. And it made me think that people are not inherently vulnerable. They're made vulnerable because of structural violence. So thank you for that. My question is, you mentioned how naming trauma can be a barrier. Can you expand on that? I think labeling or naming trauma can be a barrier. If you can expound. Thanks.
Yeah, there was just, probably I should have elaborated a bit more on that. There had been a discourse in Germany, and it was very prominent that in 2015 and 16, where a lot of people from Syria came to Germany, there was this like very prominent discourse that refugees had been traumatized. And then this kind of topos went with either way their victims or their potential perpetrators. There was a huge, you couldn't find funding without doing research on radicalization. So this was very much connected. And the question was, and this is what this guy I quoted was publishing really great about saying, so what do we need this word trauma or this idea of trauma for? And how is it, and you described this very nicely, Nora, so putting it away and saying, oh, the trauma, this is their trauma. And if we name it trauma, then we know what it is, we know the symptoms, and then we can treat it there. But saying, oh, but in the countertransference, as analysts would say, there is something that is touching me, and it's not trauma, it's like experiences, it's images, it's feelings. So it's just about what did we, scientists and the public and clinicians, what did we put into this black box trauma, as we named it then, what we weren't able and what was not bearable to look at it in research, in clinical practice. Did it answer your question?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Then I come to my closing question for you guys. So the last 75, 80 minutes we spent bringing together topics like artistic practice, clinical practice, research, lived experience, migration, grief, healing, etc. What's the one thing that you learned from one another tonight? And that goes for you too, that question.
I can say very confidently that we need to join forces and we need to do something together and learn from each other.
Yeah, probably I would answer something similar, but I would say it's a lot, and maybe I have to say that I'm very thankful for you or for the team that you brought the two of us together, because also in the pre-talk I felt there was so much in common, even though we might use different words or angles or perspectives or approaches, but still I would say somehow we do something very similar, and looking at from different biographical experiences, but and we already said we have to meet again after today, so
beautiful.
Thanks for coupling.
Thank you so much. So warm applause to our two wonderful speakers. It's what you just said, and the maybe possible future collaboration, alliances that maybe happen here now on stage, is also at the very heart of this Congress. It's at the very heart of the Healing Arts series, where we're trying to bring the scientific knowledge and the artistic knowledge, or the knowledge of the arts and the sciences together. We call it the Wissenschaft and Wissenskunst, as complementary forms of knowing. And if you're curious about the Healing Arts series, we have had over 50 speakers here in the last 2 years, always a dialogue like this, and it's called thehealingarts.online. We recorded all of these talks, so you can watch them. It covers all kinds of fields, always one expert from the field of medicine or medical research, and one from within the creative realm. Yeah, what a day. I mean, I joined only after lunch, and I learned about digital storytelling in indigenous contexts in Canada, about psychedelics, about attention and empathy, and these were just a few things on the topic of tonight. So I would like to extend the thanks to you, Anne Berghofer, Vanessa Weiss, and Stefan Willig for making this happening here. And I wish all of you a wonderful next 2 days. And I end with one thing: please turn to your neighbor and make that person a compliment. Thank you.